Today we are taking a look at another example of a funny thing that happens regularly in the low key versus the high key discussion, and that is a boss that is usually just pure mechanics causing chaos in low keys where you often see a lot less issues in high keys. Effectively a boss that is harder on low keys than it is on higher keys. We're going to take a look at that squarely today, but I gotta say, he's been playing a lot of healers recently, back to playing some Resto Druid in this one, and maybe you guys want to give him some tips too, because I think a lot of the problems that he's having is an uncomfortability with the spec as well. I'm sure you would appreciate that, but we have a lot to look at, so let's get right into it. So we have a level 9 Arakara. Before we talk about the boss, we have some funny things to note though. I thought this part was really funny to me. So they're talking about doing a big pull, right? Like the warrior is a DPS, the guy who asked that. He says big pull, and then healer says yes. The tank never says anything, but obviously he's going to do it regardless. Now I'm not really sure what's going on here, but I guess Harry's like healing people along the way, and he's just got like a full threat on shit. So he's just gonna straight up die to threat on the way. I've never even tried this. This seems like a total joke, like to even do this. Now they actually bloodless there with 2 people dying because of all this. I'm not sure if the tank just like, and then you see the shaman just getting like hammered too. Like I'm not sure if the tank even like picked any of this stuff up, but I don't know, like what do you do in this situation as a healer? You just don't do any healing whatsoever until everything's gathered, I guess. I've never done this personally, and I don't see any reason to do it, but I guess in a low key, there's no reason not to do it. Now there's another facet of the discussion to talk about in terms of like the high versus low key thing, and this is the fact that there's different affixes now. So a lot of what's going to cause them problems is actually just because the low key affixes are actually harder than the higher key affixes for this dungeon especially. I've never really seen this from the healer's perspective, but watch what this looks like. You know, we have a lot of damage coming in and the affix goes out at the exact same time. So I think this is really overwhelming, almost just like visually. Trying to get all of these off is like actually a really hard task, and as you can see, it's lingering on the DPS warrior and the shaman, and they barely get it off, but 1 stack does go on the boss. I wonder how many people actually know this, but this 1 stack is going to heal the boss, and I believe it's 10% per stack. So if you don't get this off, this is the most punishing one by a lot. I think what the problem is a lot of people don't respect it. When it comes out, they don't necessarily take it serious. Like we saw Harry just then, he instantly dispelled that, and that should mean that he's able to dispel another one. But before we get into the meat and potatoes of this video, I want to ask you guys, is it possible to pre-spell reflect this? When I was playing Death Knight during this time of these lower keys, I was able to pre-AMS it, and it would just not go on me, which is a really big tip if you have a group that is struggling to get it off people. But anyway, we actually have a pretty solid group here. I think this is a viewer of his as the rep paladin coming into the key and boosting him up a bit. He's got a 630 rep paladin in the group, and that guy's just shredding the DPS meter. But you see a lot of small deaths like this in low keys, I feel like. So because Harry's the only actual range, this picks him every time. I don't know if Harry actually knows that, but yeah, every time it picks him. And we see the shaman just gonna straight up die to that swarm there. Like failure of that sort is very avoidable, and they lose a battle res on this right now. This is really important because this is gonna come back to haunt them substantially in the next boss. But back to the affix conversation, I really have to say that this affix, and probably all of them at this level, are just harder than any other affixes we've ever had, and it's for reasons like this. So he has to like move, he's doing all these mechanics at the same time, and he's struggling to get these things off. But as you see, the boss now has 2 stacks of the heal. The boss just healed for 20% of its health with 1 DPS dead. So this is going to be a very long fight because they continue to do this poorly. But now the fun begins. I'm going to do this for the video at this point. I think this is going to be a funny way to start this part of the video. I'm going to show you how long this recording is, and I'm going to show you where we're at right now. So we're about halfway through, 18 minutes into this recording. We got another 26 minutes coming up. Take a look at how many deaths they have right now. Okay, they have 4 deaths right now. I'm going to go to the end of the footage. Okay, you see now 30 deaths. So we got 26 deaths coming up. We're going to look at every single one. Now the funny part about all this is Harry's in Discord with his friends, and his friends are like, oh yeah, no, you're going to easily double upgrade this now, because everybody assumes that the last boss is, at this point, everybody knows how to do it well, and it's actually, you know, a pretty easy fight. It's certainly not that complicated if the affix didn't exist, and you're going to see a lot of actual errors because of the affix. So right out of the gate, you're probably going to see the problem. We have a constant poison dispel. You don't necessarily get too many overlaps, but things can get a lot more complicated. Okay, you see everybody doing a great job, right? We have all 5 people surviving that. We have Harry's even getting freedom, even though he can shift out and stuff like that, and there's no real issues. Once you see the overlaps start occurring where you have both the poison dispel and the healing debuff from the affix, it becomes really complicated, and I think that's a great example of why the low key affixes are actually harder than the high key affixes, especially in a world where you know that like a lot of low key players are simply not ready. And there you see it right there. So we have the first overlap of both the poison and the healing debuff. All right, now watch how this gets handled. You can see the icon on the raid frames there. We have it on both warriors currently. Again, no dispels coming out. Now that one warrior does die, but I think, yeah, that still counts as failure. And you see the boss actually has 2 stacks of the debuff. So this boss is going to heal up 20%. Now here we make our first absurd decision. We have a battle res for this guy who just died, and the tank is still trying to reset the boss anyway. He fails to reset the boss. Watch this. Fails to reset the boss. Harry then battle reses him. No idea why you would do that. Battle reses him, and then they continue the fight. I mean, this is the low-key phenomena that we're talking about, right? Like the biggest flub you'll ever see. Like, look at this trade of bloods following Harry as well, right? I don't know. How do you guys feel about this mechanic? Do you feel like this is on the tank to gather these, or do you feel like it's on the healer to bring him to the tank? Obviously, the healer can bring him to the tank, but to me, pretty much every tank can survive this fight without actually having to get in the bloods. The tank as a warrior, he can just heroic leap out, but I think what I would like to see as a tank who can do that is you go around and start establishing aggro on these things in that phase. As a Death Knight, I can grip them in, I could taunt them, all that, but yeah, one way or the other, the fact that they are actually continuing this is a catastrophic error, and the tank does end up dying to just a circle on the ground. I don't know if he was rooted or something like that, but this is now a full wipe. They basically just wasted about 2 minutes because they really had a wipe on their hands about 45 seconds into the fight, but yeah, about 2 minutes just totally wasted on that. Still plenty of time to upgrade. I mean, obviously we know they don't because I already showed you guys that, but you're going to see how many actual wipes this is now at this point. Attempt number 2 wouldn't be World of Warcraft if people weren't discussing what went wrong now at this point, right? So we have the DPS warrior says we need more bubbles for 3 melee. I have no idea what he's talking about. I assume the bloods. And then the tank says I threw on 2, but they were nailed. Really good assessment of what occurred there. Great. Nobody talked about the fact that the guy died and then they failed to reset the boss, right? That wasn't talked about. Yeah, this poll's going a lot better. Obviously, like, you know, it's the same problem though. You're going to have these overlaps, and it's just going to be really, really hard to identify what the actual problem is at the time. I think a lot of low-key players probably aren't going to be able to identify this on the fly, but now we start to see that, like, when you're just pulling the boss over and over again, people start making new mistakes. So that shaman probably just died to the poison. This is actually a really hard fight for 3 melee too, so this isn't only a low-key issue, this is also a composition issue. 2 warriors in a group, this seems like a terrible pick. This was actually Harry's key, by the way, so I would definitely recommend not, and I don't know why he invited this warrior, but yeah, I mean, he did choose a second warrior, so we had an opportunity to get a pretty good composition for this dungeon and this affix set, and we kind of just chose not to. So that shaman is gonna onk, you know, again, salvageable here, no problem, but here is another, look at that, that is just so brutal just to see that on the screen. And again, we're gonna see a very similar issue where we're struggling to get it off the warriors, but we do that time. I think that was honestly just through healing, and we got all 5 stacks, so crisis averted. That could easily have been a wipe right there. Now, speaking of chaos, this is a low-key mistake if I've ever seen one. Watch what Harry does here. He's gonna get the dispel, and he just keeps moving for some reason, so he actually walks into his own mechanic as he dispels it. I've always joked about this as some classes having mobility that ends up hurting them. I think Resto Druid has been on that list before, where they just have so much ability to heal on the move that they end up just moving too much, and sometimes it gets them hurt. So that second wipe is going to be brought to by that failure. Really, that's it. That one failure. If Harry didn't die there, they probably could have still killed the boss, but they just don't have any battle reses. Like we said, we used a lot of battle reses on very stupid things earlier in the dungeon, so that's pretty much it now. So again, talking about what's going on, we have the paladin says we won't time it. Shaman manages to die at the first singularity. DPS warrior says, can we end? I need Arakara. Maybe drop. Paladin will help please. Don't leave from his key. I think he's basically saying I need gear from this. Can we continue and finish this dungeon? At which at this point, like, you know, it looks like they certainly can. They just made a couple small errors. It's only at 16 deaths though, so you can tell that, yeah, that number is about to go up. So yeah, another death, and I think this is just complications from being melee, right? When you have 3 melee and that poison going out, it's going to be really difficult to actually get out of it reliably. You pretty much have to probably leave melee range, right? Like, I don't know if you can configure it in a way that all 3 people can still attack, but if you're not having a serious plan for this, it's going to be really hard to accomplish this as a melee. And again, I think another death to being as melee there. The warrior then, of course, blames it on lag, which is, you know, who knows, maybe it's true, but yeah, you see it unfolding in the chat there. The paladin says, you went next to me with the poison. Yeah, and I think that's probably just really difficult for melee, especially when you're, you know, taking him in this corner. There's really only 2 directions you can move, so you almost kind of have to move backwards from it. So we're on to another pull, and the same chaos is still going to ensue on this fight, and I think this is going to be another really difficult overlap. overlap, we have the Affix out. Harry's focusing on that. And then I think, yeah, kind of just gets screwed over by his group mates, to be honest. This is probably a really common problem in the low keys. Like, we have plenty of puddles out there, and I think like the melee DPS just hardcore panic when they see this mechanic. So Harry's going to go for that puddle, but the warrior basically just leaps over the top of him, and then he gets bewildered, and again, he gets harvested. Now, again, watch the debuff. Look at the debuff. All right, again, the two warriors don't get it off themselves, and now the boss is about to heal for 20%. They have a battle res coming up in 30 seconds, the Paladin says in the chat, but the boss is basically back at 90% health after 56 seconds of combat, so they really hurt their chances of killing the fight with that happening. He's gonna get the battle res here, and everybody's still alive, so very salvageable at this point. Here comes another one of these overlaps here where we got a lot of mechanics going on top of the Affix, and yet again, so this is now the second time in this pull they are not going to be able to get the Affix off the warriors. Both warriors are going to keep it the whole time, and the boss is going to get another 20% heal stack. This is going on 3 minutes of combat, and the boss at 60%, and you know, the longer you fight these bosses, the more time you have for small mistakes like that. Another one of those really bad overlaps. It's actually crazy to watch though when you have basically all of those mechanics happening at once, and I think that's probably why a lot of people think like, oh, you know, the healing roll is so stressful, or even just the low key situation is so stressful, because look, we only had 3 people alive for that, right, and still failed to get one of these debuffs off, so another 10% of the boss's health is now going to be healed. Kind of valiantly still going though. I mean, if all of this debuff was handled right, this boss would have been dead already and they would be done. But yeah, I think honestly Harry's just dying to these bloods. I'd be eager to hear some of your guys' thoughts on whether or not this is a tank problem or this is a healing problem or what. But yeah, these things really just chomping on him the whole fight, and he's just never actually able to do much there. And now this is where it becomes a video, honestly, because this is just ridiculous, right? So after all of these mistakes, constantly dealing with all of this stress, here's the DPS warrior. He goes healer, debuff, dispel, what the fuck, it's GG. This is the guy who wanted them to finish the dungeon. This boss is gonna be back at 47% after fighting it for 5.5 minutes. But the warrior, he's gonna go for it, bro. He's gonna try to solo it, which is actually crazy to me that he thinks like this. I mean, I guess there's just a lot of people just aren't aware of how much health has been healed on this fight. They don't fully see it. But like, you think you're gonna do 197 million damage when you're the only person alive and these affixes are going out and causing this havoc? It's just, yeah, really, this is just low keys. I think, man, this is actually a great example of it. So they eventually end up just deciding to reset it, because obviously that was going to take an enormous amount of time. That goes on for another few minutes, so we end up with an 8-minute pull. Obviously this timer's long over, but here comes the discussion again. So we have the warrior saying, healer, you need to focus on dispels. Affix healing the boss by 10%. The shaman says, I can dispel myself and another after 8 seconds. Paladin says, I don't need dispels, but then the warrior asks, can the warrior dispel himself? Which is a very strange question to ask. The tank says spell block, and then he links spell block, but I guess that's something that will work as a tank only because it needs a shield. I didn't know that spell block would remove a debuff. Is that actually true? But I think it's pretty clear that we're not getting the double dispel on either end, because like there's a lot of times when the overlaps are happening, but a lot of times it's just not being dispelled. But they're going to do it one more time, and you know, you're going to see a lot of the same problems unfold, but just ultimately they're going to get it down, but not before a few more shenanigans unfold. Let's take a look at this one. They're going to get pulled in here. Harry's going to go right behind him there. He's going to make it this time. And then I don't know if he just like, I think he just heals somebody. I don't know what he does there, but he basically shifts back into regular form, which breaks it early. So he's dead, but we do have a battle res for him this time. So we're going to take the battle res. Watch this. He's going to take the battle res like in the heart of chaos, almost walks into a poison, somehow lives through that. I have no idea how he doesn't die there. Another death coming up here, this time from the warrior. Pay attention. You can kind of see him in the dead center of the screen. It's probably going to be another complication from the poison. Let's see what actually happens. I mean, he's getting very low as well, but yeah, it looks like the shaman's poison just like runs right into the warrior. Dealing with the affix better now as well. I think honestly it was just talking about it that helped that much, which is kind of rare, but yeah, I think people just needed to hear that it wasn't being handled properly. But I showed you 30 deaths. We got time for one more. Let's take a look at the shaman here. It's going to be hard to see, but yeah, ultimately probably going to get killed again by poison there, but it's going to be like an under a 4-minute fight. Even with all these deaths, that tells you that they handled the affix well, right? As soon as they started handling the affix well, the fights become so much easier. You don't realize just how much health is being added every time. I mean, 10% every time a single stack is applied. And throughout this footage, they have multiple times where 2 stacks were applied. So it really is probably the hardest low key situation that you can ever encounter, because the fight's already hectic. There's a lot going on, lots of mechanics to do and dodge. I think like the tank struggling to get the bloods and Harry struggling to bring them in, that was a big issue too. But otherwise, it was simply just the fact that the affix was overlapping. And this is why I say that the new affixes are way, way harder than the previous set of affixes. Even though everybody disliked things like bolstering and sanguine, those things did not impact bosses whatsoever. So let me know if you guys have encountered anything like this, if you guys are out there running keys. Also drop some love for the Resto Druid stuff if anybody knows anything about that. Harry's been trying to play a bunch of different healers. So moral of the story here is take the affix serious, especially if you are able to dispel it as DPS. You really got to bring that. Sometimes there's just way too much going on from the healer's perspective. So thank you for watching. We'll see you guys tomorrow for another live stream.